funding for today's lecture has come from the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. Our speaker today, Adam Seagrave, is Associate Director and Associate Professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, as well as Associate Director of the Center for Political Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. He was a member of the executive and steering committees and co-chaired the Political Science and Civics Task Force for the Educating for American Democracy project from 2019 to last year. He's currently Senior Fellow for Education with the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, where he's leading the development of a K-12 curriculum in blending American civics and diversity education. He's also co-founder and co-director of the Race and the American Story project. His research focuses on the central ideas of the American political tradition, both in the American context itself, as well as its antecedents in the history of political thought. His first book, The Foundations of Natural Morality, on the Compatibility of Natural Rights and the Natural Law, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2014. Since then, he has published Liberty and Equality, The American Conversation with the University Press of Kansas, and The Accessible Federalist with Hackett, along with numerous articles in both academic and popular outlets. He received his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Professor Seagrave's topic for today is Honesty and Optimism, a talk on slavery and racism. If you're watching online and have questions arising during the lecture, please type them into the chat feature and we'll be able to transfer them to Professor Seagrave. This lecture is being recorded. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Seagrave.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak today. Thank you to those of you who are here attending in person. Thanks to those of you who are watching online, and those of you who may watch in the future. I should preface my remarks just by exhorting you all to hang in there. I think it's probably safe to say that none of you will agree with everything I have to say, but hopefully by the end, most of you will agree with much of what I have to say. So that's just my preface and forewarning to hang in there and buckle up. Okay. If we're honest with ourselves, I think we have to face the fact squarely that American slavery was exceptionally evil. As Frederick Douglass said, we have to let this damning fact be perpetually told. It wasn't just that people were forced to work without pay. That has happened all the world over throughout human history, continuing in some places to this day. It wasn't just that there was a permanent hereditary hierarchy established between groups of people in society. That has also been a common occurrence elsewhere and at other times in history. It wasn't just that some people were treated inhumanely by their fellow man. That is, unfortunately, an inevitable consequence of the human condition. Evil and injustice are everywhere all the time, but some evils are worse than others, and American slavery was worse than most. Many great authorities on American politics agree with me on this. In his first draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson called slavery a cruel war against human nature itself. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said in a speech in the Constitutional Convention that American slavery was, quote, the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man, end quote. The most oppressive ever exercised. And Madison knew his history well. Alexis de Tocqueville, author of arguably the greatest book on the U.S. ever written, Democracy in America, puts it this way, quote, one comprehends slavery, but how does one conceive the existence of several million citizens eternally bowed under infamy and left to inherited miseries? Quote. Tocqueville put his finger on another dimension of the exceptional evil of American slavery when he said that European Americans, quote, have violated all the rights of humanity towards the black, and then they have instructed him in the worth and the inviolability of these rights. In other words, American slavery uniquely invited enslaved people to be an excluded audience for the first human society ever built directly upon the value of freedom, like a school of fish inviting a thirsty human over for drinks in the middle of the ocean. Freedom, freedom everywhere, but not a drop for enslaved African Americans. We all know about the atrocities committed by Hitler's Nazi Germany, which was responsible for the murder of about 11 million people. We all know about Stalin's Russia, which resulted in the death, imprisonment, and displacement of over 20 million people. We all know about Mao's China, which directly and indirectly killed about 40 million people. We all know about the mass murder and displacement of approximately 12 million Native Americans that occurred periodically throughout the history of the United States. African American slavery was different from all of these terrible evils. In terms of number of human lives affected, it was similar. Approximately 12.5 million African men, women, and children were kidnapped from their homes in Africa and chained on slave ships bound for the Americas. About 2 million of these people died on the journey, many of them forced into the ocean by ships' crews due to disease and food shortages. Of the 10.7 million who survived the journey, most went to the West Indies, what we call the Caribbean, and Brazil. Only 388,000 came directly to North America, what would become the United States. This 388,000 ballooned to a total of about 10 million enslaved African Americans who lived in the U.S., or what would become the U.S. between 1620 and 1860. So the numbers were similar. Tens of millions of human lives, each and every one of infinite, inestimable value. But the evil was different. It's a terrible thing to kill someone. It's a very bad thing to imprison someone and force them to work without pay. These actions and others are contrary to the rights and dignity of human nature. They are inhuman. But inhuman actions are not necessarily dehumanizing. I can act contrary to somebody's humanity without thereby denying their humanity or trying to actually extract their humanity out of them. I can act inhumanely without dehumanizing. African American slavery was different and uniquely evil because it was predicated upon deliberate dehumanization. Africans were from a very different place than the European colonists. They had different languages and cultures. Most importantly, they looked very different, having a skin color as different from Northern Europeans as possible. Not actually white and black, but close enough to get people to start thinking in those artificial terms. These very different people who talked different, acted different, and looked different were treated as property, as things that could be owned by someone else. And in case you thought this was just a legal categorization, think again. It was hereditary, passed on from mother to child, which means it's not the law that makes you a slave, it's your very being. Despite their equal creation, to quote the Declaration of Independence, a deliberate effort was made to convince African Americans and everyone else that they were in fact born slaves. Add to this the fact that this practice of trying to convince an entire society that certain people were property existed within the first political society in human history that is claimed to be based upon the self-evident truth of human dignity, and the picture is complete. There has never been before or since a more sophisticated and successful effort to dehumanize a human being than that carried out in the early United States. This thorough process of dehumanization manifested itself in innumerable acts of inhuman cruelty that were perpetrated behind the thick veil that hid the acts of slaveholders from society. Almost all of these acts have been lost to history and were never known to anyone but those who were actually involved as criminal or victim. It took almost 200 years to substantiate the rumors of Thomas Jefferson's dehumanizing interactions with Sally Hemings, due to the extreme care which Jefferson himself and others took to never allude to this reality even in private letters and notes. There's now little doubt among historians that Jefferson held Sally Hemings in sex slavery, fathering multiple children with her while she was enslaved by him. He began using her in this way when she was only about 14. Because this occurred within the confines of the slave system, Hemings had no recourse and Jefferson had no consequences. Another notable example that manifests this general situation was the infamous case of Madame LaLaurie in New Orleans. LaLaurie was a young white woman and well-known socialite who was married to an extremely rich and prominent man and lived in a big mansion. She frequently hosted lavish social gatherings at her house and held about 20 people as slaves. While her guests were enjoying their meals, drinking, and laughing downstairs, upstairs, LaLaurie had constructed a torture chamber where she would subject the African Americans she had enslaved to unspeakable horrors over the course of many years. She would keep them alive for weeks and months while they suffered unimaginable pain before finally killing them and burying them in the yard. One young girl of 7 or 8 somehow escaped to the roof before falling to her death. The serial killer who likely forced her off the roof also escaped justice, living out her life in Paris, probably in comfort and luxury. Nor did the end of legal slavery bring an end to the dehumanization and resulting horrific violence towards African Americans. Ida Wells, who should be one of the most famous and revered Americans in our history, was the first journalist to document, describe, and publicize the widespread practice of lynching in the post-Civil War South. And for this courageous act, her newspaper, ironically called the Memphis Free Speech, was destroyed, and she herself forced to leave Memphis to escape the threat of violence. Between 1865 and 1950, nearly 6,500 African Americans that we know of were murdered by lawless lynch mobs. The dehumanization that lay behind and beneath the practice of lynching is evident from the fact that postcards were made and sold of lynchings in the early 20th century. Many people found lynchings to be occasions for entertainment rather than horror. And unlike the brutal entertainment of the Roman Colosseum, lynchings were not fights with unpredictable outcomes. They were simple, brutal murders in which criminals acted outside of, and even with the blessing of, the criminal justice system. The practice of lynching was not, moreover, the result only of spur-of-the-moment passions or mobs that got carried away. It was self-consciously adopted and perpetuated over time as a tool to be used to enforce racial hierarchy and to sustain the dehumanization that had underwritten legal slavery. It was intended by many people in positions of power to be a clear reminder to all of what African Americans were in their grotesque view. Not human beings created equally by God and endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but things. Lynching, like legal enslavement, was consciously intended to reinforce and inculcate the doctrine that, as the judge in the Dred Scott decision had said, African Americans had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect, quote. White men were humans, but black men were not. One of the many more recent, in the documented 6,500, was the well-known murder of Emmett Till in 1955. Some of you, perhaps watching in the audience, might have grandparents who are old enough to remember this event well. But unless you have African American ancestry, it's likely you've never even heard of it. At least many of my students never even heard of Emmett Till. Most white Americans have never heard of the 14-year-old African American boy who was brutally murdered by 2 white men in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman in a grocery store. These murders were acquitted in court by an all-white jury who took less than an hour to decide their innocence. We know they were guilty not only from eyewitness testimony and other evidence, but from their own confession, which they publicly gave the following year in a magazine article. The white woman later admitted that she had lied about Emmett Till's actions that day. Emmett Till was a human being whose life was as important and inherently valuable as the life of Joe Biden, Donald Trump, the Pope, the Dalai Lama, and any Nobel Prize winner you'd care to mention. American racism, the more resilient twin of American slavery, had so far succeeded in dehumanizing Emmett Till that 2 people could end his life without a single apparent pang of conscience. A group of people charged with ensuring justice could free his killers without even pretending to wrestle with the decision. And the vast majority of white Americans since could go their entire lives without even hearing his story, or any of the hundreds and thousands of those like it. There have been 4 memorials to Emmett Till erected in Mississippi since his murder in an effort to keep his memory alive for Americans. The 4th one, installed in 2019, was made bulletproof to protect it against the fate of the first 3, each of which were riddled with bullet holes, with one being thrown into the same river into which Emmett Till himself had been discarded decades earlier. People are capable of incredible evil even without the cover of a slave system. But it is undeniable that the particularly dehumanizing nature of American slavery allowed and encouraged the very worst of these evils. The core of American slavery and the key to its dehumanizing effects was always anti-black racism. The 13th through 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act, and other legal milestones could address slavery, but not the racism that lay behind and beneath it. The law could only destroy what the law had made. The unique evil of American slavery was more than lawful. It was cultural and psychological, an elaborate and tragic charade in which millions of people were conditioned to treat millions of other people as non-human. It was a systematic lie about the humanity of African Americans, a coordinated and deliberate attempt to efface their humanity from existence and memory. One of the most visible manifestations of the uniqueness of American slavery relative to other slave systems of the Americas or anywhere else around the world was the ubiquity of the domestic slave trade in the United States throughout the first half of the 19th century. The spectacle of enslaved human beings led in chains to markets where they would be auctioned off like livestock was like a commercial for American slavery, and the sound of their chains like some kind of nightmarish advertising jingle. This sound and sight was extremely impactful in the lives of 2 Americans who, perhaps more than anyone else, were responsible for the abolition of legal slavery in the United States, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. When Lincoln was 22, he traveled to New Orleans, where he personally witnessed a slave auction. One of Lincoln's friends recorded the experience in this way, and this is a quote from that recorded experience. One morning, in their rambles over the city, the trio passed a slave auction. A vigorous and comely mulatto girl was being sold. She underwent a thorough examination at the hands of the bidders. They pinched her flesh and made her trot up and down the room like a horse to show how she moved, and in order, as the auctioneer said, that the bidders might satisfy themselves whether the article they were offering to buy was sound or not. The whole thing was so revolting that Lincoln moved away from the scene with a deep feeling of unconquerable hate. Bidding his companions follow him, he said, "By God, boys, let's get away from this. If ever I have a chance to hit that thing," meaning slavery, "I'll hit it hard." End quote. Frederick Douglass recalled being woken up as a boy by the sound of the chains rattling as enslaved people were being taken to market in the early morning hours. He never forgot that sound or what it meant. In his great 1852 speech, commonly called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," he described the domestic slave trade in vivid detail. I'm going to give a long quote here from that speech. Quote, "Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market. You know what is a swine drover? I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all our southern states. They perambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh jabbers, armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave market at New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mill. Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along, and the inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See, too, that girl of 13, weeping, yes, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly you hear a quick snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank and the chain rattles simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on. Follow the drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See this drove sold and separated forever. And never forget the deep, sad sobs that arose from that scattered multitude. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun you can witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking. American slavery was indeed exceptionally evil. End quote. And American freedom is exceptionally good. Nowhere and in no time in recorded history has freedom or liberty been given more accurate and complete expression, or more effective application than in the United States. The Pilgrims literally invented free government when they formulated the Mayflower Compact in 1620. People had lived with varying degrees of freedom before, but never before had all of the people in a society formally written down the principles and parameters that would regulate their social and political lives. Even the theory of free government had yet to be discovered. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau all came later and were inspired in part by the Pilgrims' example. The Mayflower Compact was built on the assumption of human equality. The agreement included not only the Puritans, who shared a common religious belief, culture, and community, but also the strangers who did not. This fact was immensely significant. It is one thing for an organic community of people who are like each other, and who therefore tend naturally to understand and like each other, to form an agreement to live under common rules. When a group of friends agrees to play by the rules, nothing is implicitly assumed or recognized about their humanity. They just agree to play by the rules because they get along with each other already. They are not just generic humans to one another, they're friends. It is a very different thing for a group of people who are thrown together by circumstance to form such an agreement. A group of strangers can't rely on the fact that they like each other, or that they share important beliefs or histories in common. A group of strangers can't rely on previous ties of kinship. They might not even look very much like each other. If strangers are to live together in community, they have to forge connections from scratch. They have to think more deeply than friends do about what they can agree upon and why. They have to figure out what they have in common with people who don't share any of the obvious visible things that make connections easy. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and necessity led the Mayflower passengers to invent a new way of living together in community that would be based not on friendship, common ancestry, or culture, but on the principle of equal human freedom. Everyone had to voluntarily agree to be part of the community and live by its rules, which was a recognition of the fact that each of them were naturally equally free to govern themselves as they saw fit. John Locke would later write that the state of nature is a state both of perfect equality and of perfect freedom. This state is the appropriate baseline or starting point for all governments. As Thomas Paine put it in Common Sense, these early European settlers of New England were literally the first humans to discover how to begin government at the right end, namely from the free human individual up to the government, rather than government dictating down to the individual. This truly epoch-making discovery for politics was made by these earliest forebears of what would become the United States of America. And then there was 1776. The colonists of British North America had been practicing the unique kind of freedom the Mayflower passengers discovered for 150 years, and their theory had finally caught up with their practice, with some help from John Locke and others. During the Stamp Act crisis of the 1760s, colonial leaders began thinking of their rights and freedoms not just as the kind of freedoms that British subjects should have, but as the kind of freedoms all human beings should have. They realized that the foundation, starting point, and glue of their communities was not their common British ancestry, but their common human nature. The rights they cared about had actually been natural human rights all along, and the freedom they cared about had been equal human freedom. They realized that the Mayflower Compact situation wasn't ephemeral, it was perennial. In other words, the apparently unique circumstances of the Pilgrims were actually revelatory of constant, permanent truths that were always hidden but never erased by the artificial fig leaves of politics. As a result of their combined practical experience and philosophical reflection, the revolutionary Americans gained insights about human nature in its relationship to politics that had never been consciously articulated before. They learned, applied, and communicated a blueprint for forming political communities between human beings simply as human beings, rather than between family, friends, neighbors, or people of common ancestry or culture. This blueprint was expressed beautifully in the Declaration of Independence. As much as we can debate whether all men are created equal really meant all human beings, and I've led dozens of hours of conversation on this exact question, the fact is that the meaning of the language is clear. All meant all, aka every, each and every single one, as the Google thesaurus has it, and men meant human being. Yes, there are problems with the cultural norm of using the single term men to refer both to a male and also generically to a human being, but that was the meaning of the word as it was used in this particular literary context. Now, people often speak of the Declaration's philosophical musings as if they were aspirational, as if these were things that Jefferson and the Continental Congress hoped might become true at some point in the future. But they didn't say we hope these dreams might come true. They said we hold these truths to be self-evident. They were claiming insight into a currently and in fact eternally true state of affairs, not an idyllic or utopian goal that might or might not materialize. All men are created equal is a statement that is either always true or always false. I think of it like the statement, all men are born naked. The clothes we wear in society tend to obscure the truth of this statement for the simple reason that we tend not to see people in their original nakedness. Just as the various inequalities present in society tend to obscure the truth of the Declaration's statement of equality, distracting us from our basic equality with all human beings. But the Declaration's principles are like the principle of original nakedness. Just because you don't see them with your eyes doesn't mean they aren't there, beneath the social conventions that tend to cover them up. And what the Declaration's principles conveyed in 1776 was just what the Mayflower Compact had conveyed in 1620, that all human beings are in fact, and not merely in aspiration, equal in liberty and dignity. It's fairly easy for a nation to aspire to be good, to aspire to uphold equal rights and liberty, to aspire to provide equal protection of the law, to aspire to promote the general welfare. Aspiration comes cheap. What the revolutionary Americans of 1776 had weren't aspirations, they were convictions. And convictions have a momentum in human history that aspirations don't. Convictions have a compulsory quality. Try saying that 10 times fast. When you have an aspiration, it's okay to put it off until tomorrow. When you have a conviction, you need to work for its accomplishment today. The Declaration clearly expressed a conviction. It was the first time in history that a political community had publicly stated a conviction as the justification for their existence. And the consequences of this statement in American history have been enormous. A free African American in Massachusetts named Prince Hall read the Declaration of Independence and immediately petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to abolish slavery because, as he put it, every principle from which America has acted in the course of her unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of abolishing African American slavery. Prince Hall based his petition directly on the Declaration's expressed conviction regarding, quote, that freedom which is the natural right of all men. In 1848, women's rights leaders met in Seneca Falls, New York, and produced a declaration of sentiments that echoed the Declaration of Independence and applied it to their cause, clarifying that all men and women are created equal, and demanding that this conviction be more faithfully reflected in law and society. One of the only men in the audience at Seneca Falls was the formerly enslaved Frederick Douglass, who called the principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence saving principles and the very ringbolt in the chain of America's yet undeveloped destiny. Former President John Quincy Adams, in his argument before the Supreme Court defending the freedom of the Amistad Africans in 1841, stated that, quote, "The moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. I ask nothing more on behalf of these unfortunate men than this declaration," end quote. He won the case, and the freedom of the Amistad Africans was upheld by the Supreme Court. Most people today spend their downtime scrolling on their phones. Abraham Lincoln spent his downtime reflecting on the conviction about equal human freedom expressed in the Declaration. During one of these downtimes, he wrote that, quote, "Most governments have been based practically on the denial of the equal rights of men. Ours began by affirming those rights," end quote. At another time, he wrote that the principle of liberty to all was entwined, as he put it, around the human heart, and that this principle was the primary cause of our great prosperity. The purpose of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery and the affirmation of the Declaration's conviction about equal human freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't by itself prove this, but Lincoln's determination to pass the 13th Amendment in the last weeks of his life and at the cost of prolonging the Civil War does. The 620,000 Americans who lost their lives during the Civil War did so in order to achieve a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln put it in the Gettysburg Address. This new birth was a reincarnation of the first birth of freedom announced in 1776 and would not have been possible without it. 50 years after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, that's 100 years after, as you're wondering, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In this speech, King famously said that, quote, "When the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir," quote. What King meant was that the statement of fact and of conviction about this fact, expressed in the Declaration's self-evident truths, provided a kind of historical momentum that led directly to the culminating moment of his great speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, was signed into law the following year. In 2008, in the iconic speech that ultimately secured his election as the first African-American president in our history, Barack Obama began by harking back to the farmers and scholars, statesmen and patriots who had traveled across an ocean to escape tyranny and persecution, and who made real their Declaration of Independence by framing the Constitution to secure its principles of equal human freedom. The incredible momentum of America's founding conviction led ultimately, however tardily, to the abolition of slavery, the securing of political rights for women, protection of civil rights for African Americans and other minorities, and the election of the first African American president of the United States. The fact that there are more complications to this story does not disprove its basic truth. American progress is real, and it has been driven primarily by the true idea of equal human freedom that was given its first public expression in the Declaration of Independence. Every American of every color who has given their lives to further this progress has been motivated, driven, and sustained by this conviction. No other nation in human history has a story like this. Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Douglas, Lincoln, and King weren't just being dramatic or ethnocentric when they said that the fate of human rights and freedom around the world depended upon the example of the United States. The American experiment has been an incredibly unique, high-stakes, and precarious enterprise from the beginning. No other nation has tried to base their political institutions on self-evident truths before, and none to my knowledge has done so since. The American Declaration of Independence announced a reversal of the order of might and right in human affairs, and the mere attempt has had a profound effect on all of humanity. American freedom is exceptionally good. Now, in case you didn't notice, what I just did hasn't been done since at least 1852. I just talked for more than 10 minutes straight about the exceptional evil of American slavery, and then for more than 10 minutes straight about the exceptional good of American freedom. The fact that this is an unthinkable feat for nearly everyone involved in our current debates about issues of race in American history is a sign of just how deep our problems are. We need more knowledge and we need more courage. We need more honesty and we need more optimism. Once we have these, we will finally recover our true national greatness and bring America's unique and crucial contribution to humanity finally to completion. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone on the online or in person here might have. Maybe have some discussion too.
I'll ask a question. I'm curious about, well, especially about the phrase "all men are created equal," but about Thomas Jefferson, or the other founding fathers too, who signed the Declaration of Independence. And whether you think it's important to discover or debate what Thomas Jefferson meant. You kind of brought up the idea that when he said all men, well, you say all men in 1776, it perhaps includes all women as well. The idea of, a man holding people in slavery, does he mean all men, or does he only mean white men? Is it possible that a guy who claims to own all these slaves could, without, ridiculous hypocrisy, claim that he also thinks that everyone's created equal? So I'm curious about just that intention.
Thanks for that question. It's I put it in sort of simplified terms as if it were a clear answer to the question, but I do actually think that it is very worthwhile to have that discussion and debate. So I continue to ask the question and talk about it whenever I have the chance, because I think it does reveal important dimensions of history and of human nature and of what we think about the founders. So no, I think that's a really worthwhile question to explore in a bunch of different ways. I think that one aspect of the difficulty as we try to wrap our minds around the fact that Jefferson, in particular, just to use him as the clearest, most contradictory example, right? That he said all men are created equal, wrote that, of course, has this long paragraph condemning slavery in the harshest of terms in his draft. Yet he does these terrible things and holds many people in slavery throughout his life. But how do we reconcile those things? I think that part of it is down to what Justice Taney expressed in the Dred Scott decision when he put forth this interpretation that the Declaration couldn't have meant all men in the sense of all human beings, right? Particularly not including African Americans or enslaved African Americans, because, as he put it this way, he said, because the founders were great men and they were incapable of acting contrary to principles they espoused. That's what he actually said. So I think to some extent there's that we think of the founders, at least many Americans do, as such great people, or as better than most of us, or something like that. And at the same time, we're aware of how bad slavery was, right? So how can we reconcile these things? I think hypocrisy is something that we're all familiar with. We all act one way and say something else, and there's a mismatch between our principles and actions. But this is a particularly extreme case of that, so I think it's hard to come to grips with that. But I do think, that a lot of what we're dealing with when we look at slavery and race in American history are extremes, sort of very starkly contrasted extremes, which I tried to bring out. And I think that's part of what we see here with the statement of the Declaration and the actions. That on the one hand, I think we have a clear statement of principle. I think that is what was meant, right? Whether or not they all thought it through as we do today, right, is a different question. I think you have a clear statement of this great principle, and then a very, very clear, clearly evil, exceptionally evil, as I argued, practice. And I think that shows us kind of the spectrum of what human beings are capable of, right? We're capable of understanding and articulating these really important truths, but then we're also capable of perpetrating terrible evil, and that's just the way human nature is. But it happened to coincide with the American founders in a specific way. Frederick Douglass, in his 4th of July speech, which I quoted from, he brings up at the beginning of that speech the metaphor of distance. So he talks about the distance between he himself as a formerly enslaved African American and his audience, and he talks about the distance of time. Distance is a recurrent metaphor throughout that speech, and I think that that's one way of looking at the Declaration statement, that what we're looking at here is a tremendous distance between principle and practice. That's a really powerful tension. So, so I think it's still worthwhile to talk about that difficulty and explore it and try to interpret, to some extent to get inside the minds of the founders. What were they thinking, right? And how could they have done this? But I do think, I think that all men are created equal did mean all human beings. And then the next step is, okay, well, how do we reconcile that with the practice?
Yeah, I mean, this might be a little related, but I was just thinking by what you were saying about, the United States being the only country sort of in history to this point founded on the principle of this principle of freedom. And I was just wondering, about things like, say, the French Revolution and things like that. How would you define revolutions like that, or documents like the Declaration, the rights of man and the citizen, as different from this principle of freedom found in the United States? What makes our principle unique compared to all other systems?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, and and of course that claim on my part is arguable in various ways. You might disagree with that by raising examples from previous recorded history, but so I think, and certainly there are examples of societies that one might call free in various ways before the early American settlers. So what I meant to focus on in that claim was the conscious and explicit recording of the principle, right, through the Mayflower Compact first, and then through the Declaration of Independence, and the fact that conscious, explicit, written down statement in those cases was meant to serve as the beginning point of a political community. So I think in that way, and then added to that what the content of those statements were, right? The idea that people are equally free in a kind of state of nature, or that human beings are all naturally equal and free to one another. That being the conscious starting point of a political society. In that sense, I think there is that uniqueness to the American case. But again, it is arguable in various ways, but that's my opinion.
With the passing of the Juneteenth holiday in recent years, the ending of slavery has been a bit back in the limelight. Do you feel that there's any kind of lingering evils still left in modern society from that time frame? And is there anything that we can do as a society about these lingering evils?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of are there continuing problems in society that stem from slavery, essentially? Yeah, that's a big question, of course, and a very controversial one. Actually saw a humorous, sort of darkly humorous T-shirt the other day. An African American man was wearing this T-shirt that said Juneteenth, free-ish since 1865, and so it's just sort of that reflection that yes, it was. I think the legal abolition of slavery was a major milestone of progress and was extremely important, of course. So I think that's the case. But I do think that because of the nature of American slavery, particularly because of its connection to and basis in racism, right? So in the construction of different racial groups and a hierarchy between them, it's recognizable, it's visible, it's hereditary. I think because of some of those characteristics that there have been since that time certainly continuing effects and legacies of slavery that we haven't been able to overcome. That was clearer certainly before the Civil Rights Act, so in that 100-year period between the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, it was of course abundantly clear during that time. And I think the argument that we have more today is, since the Civil Rights Movement, to what extent is that still the case, that we are still living through the effects of slavery? And there too, I would say that absolutely there are all kinds of ways in society in which we see the ramifications of slavery and racism. And this is something, you know, on the one hand you can say this is an opinion of the contemporary left or progressives. On the other hand, you know, I read Tocqueville, and Tocqueville said the abolition of legal slavery is going to be the starting point of America's problems with race. It's not going to be the ending point, it's going to be the starting point of it, because the consequences of slavery are going to be far longer lasting and more difficult to deal with. Tocqueville said that in the 1830s. And the founders thought this too. I mean, Madison and Jefferson and others, they were fearful of abolition and emancipation, not just for sort of personal or selfish reasons, but because they foresaw how difficult the transition would be for a society out of slavery. So I mean, their question was, how are we possibly going to form a society of equals, political equals, social equals, out of formerly enslaved people and former slaveholders, particularly when they will always look different from each other, right? So of course there has been all sorts of biological intermixing of races and ethnicities that has increased sort of the spectrum of color that we see in the United States. But it's a hereditary marker that they knew would always be there, that would always cause social tensions in various ways. So I think that in a way it's both a sort of historical conservative opinion to think that the ramifications of slavery are ongoing, and a progressive liberal opinion. I think the question of what to do about it is maybe also what separates people today, right? So granted there are these effects of slavery, but what do we do about it? What policy-wise, right? I think that's but yeah, to answer the question in short, yes, I think absolutely we still see the effects of slavery in all sorts of aspects of society.
A question from the audience. The question is, what is your position on the idea that slave owning by the founding fathers can be mitigated by the status quo for wealthy aristocrats at the time?
So, and this is a version of so another point that Tocqueville made, and that others made at the time, which was that the domestic slavery is different from the slave trade. In other words, that as Jefferson put it in his draft of the Declaration of Independence, we were sort of stuck with slavery, right? They were born into the system, inheriting slaves, and so the argument is, well, that was those were the circumstances of the time, right? And then further, should we today, 200 some odd years later, right, should we claim a kind of moral vantage point by which we could condemn the slaveholding founders for holding slaves, given that it was the social convention of the time, right, or something like that? Should we be morally condemning them? My answer to that, first of all, I think the point has to be made that the founders themselves condemned slavery, right? So it's not as if they were unaware of the evil of slavery. I listed some of the quotes there for Jefferson and Madison. There were lots of others. So they were aware of how evil slavery was, so we can't say that at their time they didn't have the same moral insight that we do today, because they did. The issue is, given their circumstances, should we have expected them to do more, practically speaking, to abolish it? And that, I think, is a more difficult question, and I think there are good points to be made, I think, sort of on either side of that debate. On the one hand, there are the gains that were made by compromising with slavery and forming a union, forming a constitutional union at the time that wouldn't have happened if there was a more radical attempt to abolish slavery. The way that slavery ended, you could argue, and the way that we've attempted to overcome racism in the United States, has been better, perhaps, than what might have happened if the Union hadn't been formed, and if if we had that conflict right at the beginning. So I think that was a prudential question for the founders. But that said, I'm sympathetic with the argument that William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown and others give, which is that the enormity of the moral evil of slavery was such that perhaps, of course you can't pronounce judgment on individual people, right? But perhaps if I or we were in their circumstances, perhaps we should have abolished slavery and freed our slaves, right? So I think there is something to that argument, as hard as it would have been. There is the story of Edward Coles, friend of Jefferson's, who inherited a dozen or so slaves, and he was prevented from emancipating his slaves by the laws of Virginia. It's very difficult for him to do so. That's the other part. Of course, even the laws prevented slaveholders in many cases from freeing their slaves. So what Coles did, though, is he left Virginia. So he actually left Virginia, moved to Illinois, and freed his slaves in Illinois, gave them parts of his land that he had bought there, and lived out there for the rest of his life in Illinois, where he could free his slaves. And he wrote to Jefferson. Since he did this, he wrote to Jefferson a number of times, mentioning this thing that he had done and saying, well, why, Thomas, why don't you do this too? And Jefferson didn't really ever address that question directly in his letters. But so it was possible for the founders to do more. It wasn't as if it was impossible. That said, I think that, we can't, I as a person am not going to judge anyone else morally speaking, living or dead. But I'd like to think that if I or if some of us were in that circumstance, that we would have done whatever it took to try to abolish slavery.
Another question. Since you're speaking about the founders and how they used slavery as this evil while still practicing it, I'm just wondering, because by the time of the Civil War, most slave owners had come around to this idea that slavery was a positive good, that slavery was actually somehow in line with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, historians debate when this paternalist idea took hold. Was it the immediate before prior to the Civil War, or did it go all the way back to the founding? And I'm just wondering, what's your take on that? Were the founders all just sort of universally against slavery while they were practicing it, or were there any of them who were trying to make this positive good argument that it actually belongs in a free society?
Yeah, that's a good point. And no, I think as far as I know, that's correct, that the positive good argument wasn't around at the time of the founding. Not that I've ever been able to find. I think it's, as far as my studies have taken me, it's true to say that the founders, even the slaveholding among the founding generation, viewed slavery as a necessary evil in their terms, right? And in Lincoln's terms that he later used to describe their stance towards slavery. So I think that's right, that the positive good argument that slavery is actually a good thing did not develop, at least in the United States, until later in the lead up to the Civil War. Probably in the 1830s, I think, is when it developed. So Lincoln says this as well in one of his speeches. I don't recall which one, but where he says that his speech on the Dred Scott decision, that no American had ever said that the self-evident truths of the Declaration didn't apply to African Americans until the Dred Scott decision, basically, until right at that time in the mid-1850s. Nobody had ever even said that before, that it didn't apply. What they had said previous to that was that the Declaration was false, right? That the self-evident truths were actually, to quote a Southern politician at the time, self-evident lies, right? So that's what they had said. So so the argument that slavery was a positive good was not around earlier, and even the slaveholding founders viewed it tend to view it as at least an undesirable thing and a problematic thing, but then many of them also viewed it as an evil thing, but just that they weren't ready to get rid of. But yeah, I think that's right.
Just kind of a larger, more abstract question. Since you operating, but also this tremendous good, this kind of exceptional quality about the foundation of American political institutions. I'm wondering about the very concept of liberty and whether it only makes sense defined negatively against slavery. You know, liberty is the absence of being not enslaved. Light is being not dark, that kind of stuff. And if that would make sense to a lot of white slaveholders in a room to say, like, yeah, we want to be free, we want to exercise liberty, that is a good thing, and we know firsthand what that means. After 1865, when you no longer have any legal slavery in the United States, does liberty still mean the same thing? Does American freedom still mean the same thing when there's no longer a legal slavery that would be its opposite?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and yeah, it's and actually I think Rousseau says something like this in his On the Social Contract, right, where he says that he sort of raises that as a question. I think, I mean, is it possible to have a free society without slavery? And for a number of reasons, right? One being that, of course, having an enslaved population to do a lot of work allows people to engage in other pursuits and to in particular to participate in politics, right? So maybe the freedom to govern yourself politically is such a full-time job that you actually can't work out other than that, at least not much, and so you need a slave to do it for you, right? So there's that kind of practical way in which you might say liberty is premised upon slavery practically, but then also I think there's definitely something to the sort of the definitional point, right, or the psychological point that you appreciate your freedom more when it's juxtaposed with slavery, right? That's probably right. I mean, I think Edmund Burke commented on that in his speech on conciliation with the colonies. He was talking about the American colonists' love of freedom, and when he talks about the southern colonies that where slaveholding is common, he makes that argument. He says that the love of liberty is even more intense in the southern colonies because of the fact that they have an enslaved population that they live right next to, and that makes them love their freedom more, right? Because they see what the absence of it looks like. Yeah. So I think that there's definitely something to that you take things for granted when you don't see their opposite. So I think practically speaking, there's some truth to that liberty is in a way enhanced by its juxtaposition with slavery. But I think that from a conceptual standpoint, from an abstract standpoint, that liberty doesn't require slavery, or in theory, right? I think that liberty is the primary substantial principle of human nature, characteristic of human nature, and that slavery is the absence of that. So I think from an abstract theoretical perspective, slavery is the privation of liberty rather than sort of being defined the other way around. And practically speaking, gosh, that is the American experiment. I think whether we can have liberty without slavery, to what extent we can have liberty without slavery, and I mean, it's to some extent that's an open question, right? I'd like to think that we have shown that that it's possible to varying degrees, especially since the abolition of slavery. But I think it's an experiment. It's precarious.
Are there more questions online?
Yes. Okay, so this is another question from the audience. So if it is possible to acknowledge the enormity of the unjust practices endorsed by American governments and perpetuated by American individuals and throughout our history on one hand, and also to understand and appreciate the world historical contributions of American principles and achievements on the other, what is the advantage doing so as a country?
Yeah, what is the advantage of doing so as a country? Okay, I guess, so I guess the thinking behind the question is that it may advantageous from a theoretical standpoint or an educative standpoint to sort of understand both of these truths, but perhaps from a national standpoint, right? I guess practically speaking, what is the advantage to the United States of holding these two truths in mind at the same time? I guess that's probably something like, okay. Well, I think for one thing, I think it may be practically, I mean, it may be our only way out of our current debates and controversies that are really tearing the country apart. I think it might be the only way out. I mean, it may be the only good way out, because I think if either side of the current controversies wins and succeeds in simply defeating and dominating and discrediting, eliminating the other, I think that would be an undesirable outcome either way, and one that's unsustainable. I think that would be unsustainable. So, so for example, I mean, I think we're actually seeing that. We're seeing it to some extent now with the difficulties of Biden's presidency and the controversy surrounding Trump's presidency and the upcoming election, all the division that we're seeing, that we're at an impasse, I think, in many ways. And I do think part of the impasse, it's very complicated, but part of it comes from the fact that there actually are important truths on both sides of the debate. In other words, there really are, I think, good reasons to really take seriously and reflect upon the injustices of American history that have reverberations continuing to the present day. And I think that's in my opinion, an important truth to recognize. And then on the other hand, it's essential that we recognize the principles that our country was founded on and that are also true principles that have had a practical effect, in achieving progress. So, I do think that unless our country, unless people on both sides of the current controversy come to at least some recognition of the truth on the other side and how it combines with what they see as the truth, I think unless we can get to that point, I really have a hard time seeing our way out. And I mean that from the perspective of being a democratic republic, right? I mean, because we can go on and become more and more of an authoritarian style government and function that way. But if we're going to function democratically in any sense of the term, we have to be able to deliberate in common. And to deliberate in common, you have to have enough common ground. I just think you can't do it. I mean, the compromise only goes so far. At some point, you have to be able to deliberate to consensus, whatever that consensus, might be. It might be limited, but you have to do that, in my opinion. So unless we can do that, I just think our character as a democracy, to the extent that we still have it, just completely goes away. So I think that that's the national advantage, is that we have to find a common ground between these positions that most people can agree on. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to deliberate in common about our lives together.
Other online questions? We do have one last question about marijuana convictions. And the question is, we all know people serving up to 20 years in prisons for the possession of 2 ounces of marijuana. Laws have changed today. Should we condemn the lawmakers who enacted laws and lived under them 50 years ago?
Should we condemn them? And I assume that means in a moral sense. Yeah. I mean, I think they were bad laws, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that. I think the criminal justice system, I do think, is one of the clearest areas of our society where you can see the impact of the history of slavery. I think that's the case, and that laws about the criminalization of drugs like marijuana, they don't stem entirely from that history of racism. There are other causes and other reasons why you might want to have laws criminalizing drug use and drug possession. But I do think they were used and have been used by racist people at times for racist purposes. I think there's record of that. And so it has had a really, really tremendously negative impact on all sorts of issues in Black American communities over the last 50 years. I mean, from breaking up families and poverty and cycles of criminality. I think all of those things were exacerbated by some of these laws, right? These bad laws. So I think that we should try to fix those laws, definitely. Definitely try to fix those laws and try to fix the criminal justice system. That's something that I think is one of the few common ground issues, actually, in terms of practical issues across the political parties, is that most people on both sides of the partisan divide think that the criminal justice system has problems and that need to be fixed. So yes, we should fix it. Whether we should condemn the people who were involved, again, I do think, just as a principle, as a moral principle, I do think that I'm not going to condemn anyone personally because I can't judge someone's soul, right? I'm not going to do that myself. But we can say they were bad laws, I think, and I do think many of those laws were bad laws, and we should fix them. But yeah, that's a big, clear area where we see the history of enslavement and racism continuing to play out. Yeah.
Obviously, your advice to designers of curriculum would be to combine both the good and the bad in American history. Could you give more specific advice at the K through 12 level and at the level of higher education as to how designers of curricula should go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think that's really important that we do combine the two in educating students, both in higher ed and K to 12 level. And I think, there are a number of dimensions to that task. And a lot of what's out there right now, so I think a lot of what's out there right now exemplifies the way that we shouldn't do it. And so I'm thinking about, and this is on both sides of the question. So on the one side, you have a lot of faculty in departments at universities who teach topics of American history and topics of identity and race in a way that certainly overemphasizes that sort of negative, bad story, right? The story of the evils in American history and in human beings. And it does so in such a way that the emphasis actually, I think itself actually dehumanizes people, because it turns people and societies into like physics problems, physical objects that our relationships are like power struggles, right? And that's all they are. Right? All we have is power dynamics in society and that kind of thing. And all we are as individuals are intersections of different identities that have been constructed outside of us and that define who we are at a deep, deep level. And that, I think, is really problematic, the way that those topics tend to be taught in a lot of departments by a lot of faculty in higher education. And then that has, of course, trickled down to K-12 education. And this is, what people generally talk about as critical race theory, which has become something different in our conversations than it was in the 1970s, I think, when it originated. But it's related, but different. So I think that, on the one hand, I think a lot of what we have out there now, when we talk about race and diversity and identity in K-12 schools, has come from the way we've taught about it in higher ed for a while, which is this exaggerated, distorted, dehumanizing kind of approach. and which is, stems from basically the first half of my talk, right? That just sort of blown out of proportion and not placed in conjunction with the other side of the story. So, but then on the other side, I think we have then reactions to that, which in some ways go back to previous forms of education at the K-12 level, which was basically that American history is really, really good, and it's a big story of progress, and any bad that's happened is, it's there, but is overcome by the good. And I think that, for example, Hillsdale 1776 curriculum, and a lot of the approach that Hillsdale College and others like and take. And I say this as someone with a lot of friends at Hillsdale, and I think they do really, really good work in many ways. But I do think that their approach to teaching American history certainly errs on the side of being triumphal and neglecting of that other side, right? Of the side that honestly recognizes the historic and ongoing evils in American society and how to address them. So I think that, so how do you do that in a curriculum? First of all, you expose students as widely as possible to historical facts and documents that show both sides of that story, right? That show the full spectrum, essentially. So you teach students honestly about the history of slavery, and you don't always pair it with a but, right? You don't always pair it with, yes, we had slavery, but it's gone now. You teach them really seriously about the history there, and teach them about racism in a way that they can appreciate how bad it is and why it's wrong. But then also teach them the American founding documents and teach them about the importance of American founding principles and the goodness of American institutions that are built on those principles. And I think you can teach them both. And when you ask, well, how do they hold us together? I think it's important to ask that question in classrooms and to talk about it and to explore it as a subject for open inquiry and debate and discussion, and to try to understand how it fits together. And that's a tough thing to do. I think especially in K-12 classrooms, it's tough to teach students in a way that supports their own formation of answers to difficult questions, right? Especially in younger grades. But I think it can be done, and I think it's important to do that, because I think that the narratives we have right now are way oversimplified. They're problematically oversimplified to the extent that they're really not true, because they're excluding often really large, important parts of the truth. So yes, I mean that's a long and maybe not terribly specific answer to your question, but I do think it's important to teach students K through college about both the bad and the good in American history, and to do so in a way that doesn't minimize either, that doesn't sort of put either in the primary, so to speak, role, but holds them together and tries to appreciate both.